The Short Game is listener-supported on Patreon. If you'd like to support the show and join us on our Discord, head to theshortgame.net or patreon.com/theshortgame. Welcome back to The Short Game. This is a show about short video games, games that respect your time. I'm Reagan Kelly, and I'm joined by two fine co-hosts.
Bucket Heininger.
And Stanley.
Yes, thank you, my brother and bro host, Stanley. We're talking this week about the Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe.
I am so happy to talk about this game, Reagan. We talked about the original, 8 years ago?
Something like that.
Our second ever episode.
Literally episode 2.
We didn't have our cameras on. I could not tell the difference between Shane and Reagan over our bad microphones, and we tried to do a video game podcast. And here we are, 8 years later, to continue to try.
We've barely progressed at all.
Our equipment is a little bit better, and I still can't tell the difference between the two of you, but I do know that I am a big fan of the Stanley Parable. It has been probably still one of my favorite games that we've covered on this show. And so the whatever we want to call this, I have been excited about for quite a while, and I'm very happy to talk about with the two of you.
Yeah, the Stanley Parable is, it was one of the games that made me want to start this show. It is one of the most, I think, important video games of all time, from a narrative standpoint and just like really good big ideas standpoint. The Stanley Parable is just an absolute landmark video game. We're going to be talking about the new Stanley Parable game, Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe, today, which, very minor spoiler, is an expanded version of the original game that essentially contains its own sequel. This is sort of like a Stanley's iconic hat kind of situation, like we talked about with the Frog Fractions games. This is a game that the Stanley Parable is here in its original entirety, and it is a nicely updated version. But the Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe extends that with new content that is at least as significant as the original game in terms of length, and it's extremely funny. It's got lots of good ideas. I'm so glad to get to return to talk about the Stanley Parable some more. But I was also just blown away at after almost 10 years after the release of the original game, them coming back with this expanded version that is essentially the Stanley Parable 2.
Yeah, this isn't even really the very first time they have taken this approach with the Stanley Parable. The game was originally created way back in 2011. When it finally made its way to Steam, it was colloquially known as the HD remix of the Stanley Parable. And so now I guess we have the Stanley Parable HD Remix Ultra Deluxe Edition. Mm-hmm. And yeah, they've continued to kind of grow this game. This is, by the way, I feel like a tricky one for us to cover in terms of spoilers, because when it comes to spoilers, this is a comedy game at its core. This is a comedy game that's playing with some really big ideas, but jokes are perhaps the most fragile thing to spoil. So if you are a listener of this show, and I'm sure you did not pour back through all of our back catalog and listen to the very first one, and somehow you managed to miss this title, I would just encourage people to go and play this game sight unseen. That said, I'm very much looking forward to discussing it today.
Yeah, perhaps more than any game we've ever covered, I would say 100% pause this podcast and go play this. If you haven't played the Stanley Parable, the original game, just pause this podcast and go play it. And if you haven't played the Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe, we will have a spoiler break probably pretty early in this episode. We're going to talk a little more about sort of the original game and then a little bit of what this game does to expand on it. But before we get into the area of talking about various different new endings or talking about our favorite bits or anything where we might dim the experience for you a little bit, we will have a spoiler break, so don't worry. I do want to spend a couple more minutes talking about the original game before we dive into talking about new stuff. The Stanley Parable is just such a landmark and important game in my life and in games in general. And going back to this, like, made me like remember everything that I loved about the original Stanley Parable. You know, what Shane mentioned earlier about that this having originated as a Half-Life 2 mod. It's such an incredible development story. You know, Davey Wreden created this, pretty much by himself. He was like 22 years old, which is wild and makes me feel so inadequate that he created such an incredible landmark work at such a young age.
And we were basically, right around that same age too when he made this game. So it's like,
it's embarrassing. It makes me feel like such a failure. My God, what have I done?
You have become Stanley.
Yeah.
You sit
We've
at a
all
computer and
become Stanley.
receive
Oh, God.
orders and press buttons. So the character of Stanley, we should say, is a man who spends his days pushing buttons as commanded by his boss, who issues orders to him via a system of monitors. However, one day, Stanley notices that he hasn't received any orders in hours. And standing up from his desks, he finds that his coworkers appear to be gone, and the events thereafter, very flavorfully narrated, are therefore going to change his life forever.
Yeah, he loves his job. He really enjoys doing the job, and the job is literally, it's like, old DOS-looking screen. It'll say, like, press M for 1 second. It moves his little finger over and presses M for 1 second. Then press Q for 3 seconds. And he's just following that over and over and over. And he loves that job until suddenly no one is there. And you're now in control or not in control by a lovely narrator who has what a wonderful voice, and really
British voice actor Kevin Brighting does the narration, both in the original game, and he's returned for Ultra Deluxe to narrate all of the new content.
And he's even better, I think, in the new one.
Oh yeah,
he's incredible. He's such an incredible performer here. He's just there's so many different vibes that he has, but he's such a consistent, wonderful voice in this game. And he's been great in the he's stuck with this. Like, this is a huge project for him. Like, you go to his Twitter and his bio is just the narrator. Like, he clearly loves this thing. He's done like pro bono voice acting for like Stanley Parable fan projects and things. Like, this is something that he's really proud of, and he should be. This is like one of the best narration performances I've ever seen.
And it is the game, right? I mean, like, obviously the writing is what sets it all up, but I think the biggest thing that you take away or you remember from the game is the narrator and the narrator's voice. It is a constant. There's obviously some sound design and some, sort of Foley work, but the narrator is the driving force of the entire game.
Absolutely. Mm. So the Stanley himself really is kind of just a vessel for the choices of the player, right? But the narrator is both the protagonist and antagonist of this story, and it's the writing that they put almost 0 words in Stanley. They put 0 words in Stanley's mouth. There are no words that Stanley says, only things that occasionally the narrator says he said, or something along those lines.
Yeah.
But the writing that they actually do give the narrator is some of the best writing in games. Some of it's poetic. I wrote down, because of course the main theme of the Stanley Parable is choice. And there's a moment in one of the PSAs that he plays for you where he says, "And finally, if you ever begin to wonder if your choices are actually meaningful, and if you'll ever make a significant contribution to the world, just remember that in the vastness of space, your thoughts and problems are materially insignificant, and the feeling should subside.
Yeah, there's it does some similar sort of joke structure too with like Portal, which was, coming out around the same time, or maybe a little bit before, of just like, you mean nothing and nothing matters at all. But they express it in such a eloquent way that is both funny and sad at the same time. And it's constant with things like that.
At some point in the original Stanley Parable, it spends time thinking and making jokes, but also really insightful jokes about pretty much every potential angle or rabbit hole you can go down when thinking about the nature of free will, the nature of the relationship between a character and a player in a video game, the relationship between a character and an author, the relationship between a reader or player and a creator. It takes the time to sort of interrogate, like, what does it actually mean when you make a choice in almost every potential possible way you can, and it does that in the funniest way that it can think of in every possible turn.
And if you haven't. If you did not take our initial advice and shut off our own podcast and go and play the game, and you're wondering, how does it actually execute on this? It's actually pretty genius and very, very simple the way they set up this framework, and then they build on it and build on it and build on it. But basically, as Shane said, the game starts with the narrator explaining that, you're this guy Stanley, you're working in your job that you love, and suddenly everyone's gone, and now you're in control of Stanley. And the narrator is explaining the things that you're doing, but it's all you're essentially on rails at the very beginning. The first 30 seconds to a minute of the game, you're on rails. You can only go through a certain amount of doors. The narrator will say, if you stop in rooms and start looking around at stuff, the narrator will catch on to that and say things like, no matter how hard Stanley looked, he could not find his coworkers, or he found no evidence of his coworkers, or whatever, until you get to a room that has 2 doors. And
the big first choice.
Yep, the big first choice. And then the narrator says, and Stanley went through the left door. And it's at that point where you are still in control of Stanley, and it's entirely up to you if you go into the left door or if you go into the right door. If you go into the left door, story continues. The narrator is happy. He continues on with his little, story that he's created, and you go into the meeting room and uncover a whole thing, and so on and so forth. And the story basically goes unimpeded. But if at any point you make a choice that is not what the narrator says, like, for instance, you go through the right door instead of the left, it spawns a whole new world of dialogue and potential outcomes that the narrator will walk you through. And it gets wackier or more existential or like scary or whatever. I mean, there's, how many endings are there in the original game? Dozens. So, like, as Reagan said, they pick apart everything you could think of around the concept of choice. And they also do a great job of just making fun of basically every type of video game at the same time as well, especially types of games that were trendy in that time period.
So what you're saying there kind of about the existential element of it, there's a couple of these endings that, one from the original and one that I think is new that really kind of drill into this. And this is the part of the writing of the game that I like the best. There's an ending that's called the Zending, or the Zen ending. In this one, to reach this ending, you'll have to have made some pretty concerted efforts to derail the story by leaping off of a moving platform that you're supposed to ride, according to the narrator. And so you're at this point, you're kind of wrestling with the narrator about kind of what direction the story is going to take and what's going to happen. And the narrator basically comes with you into this room where it's kind of a beautiful star field. And he says, well, the narrator is kind of realizing that the two of you are trapped in a cycle that can't be broken, and this is the way out, he says, is to just stop in this room that's beautiful and full of stars and stay there and not progress the game at all. Now, of course, you as the player, this is one of those circumstances where the conflict between you as the player and you as the narrator is really forced, because if you are going to continue to play the game, sure, you have to do something, and what you can do in that moment is to climb a tower and jump down over and over again, killing yourself.
Yeah, this is definitely one of the more powerful endings.
Yeah, while the narrator pleads to you not to do it and basically tries every tactic, and the thing that I love about the writing in that scene is that as you go through this, the narrator is trying every possible way to talk you out of it, and the emotion that's coming through is so powerful, and he's pleading so much, and then the game resets and restarts, and everything, both you and the narrator, are reset to the beginning, and that is like the sort of enforce. There's lots of games where you have this kind of scenario, but it's not kind of lit in this same way, where if effectively this is war games, the only choice is not to play, where the cruelty of the game is part of the game, where it's enforced, and the only choice you have to make is a bad one. And I don't know, I just loved that part. And that's one of the kind of key existential elements. And I was really reminded of that ending when we got to one of the endings with the fast forward button or the skip button. I don't know if anyone wants to talk about the skip button. This was one of my favorite things they've added.
It really is, but it's also new content, so we need to put that off for just a minute. But my goodness, you're right. That is probably the most powerful the new content gets. I can't wait to talk about it.
Yeah.
So the original game, incredible. If you haven't played it in a while and you want a kind of a recap before going into the Stanley Parable, the new content, first of all, the new game does include the entire original game, and it begins with a question on screen where it will just ask you. Well, actually, first it asks you to set the time. We'll come back to that. But then it will give you an option to choose whether you have played the original Stanley Parable or not. And if you choose that you have, then it sort of greases the wheels for you a little bit to get into the new content. So you're initially going to be in what appears to be a complete remake or remaster of the original game with essentially no changes. The new content percolates into the experience in surprising ways, but initially you'll see just basically the original game. But if you are coming to this from from the start, you don't need to go buy the separate original Stanley Parable. It is all here. The entire game the entire original game is here, and if you choose that you have not played the game before, it's going to give you the original Stanley Parable experience. If you played that game way back in 2013 or 14, and you just want a refresher, obviously you can go and play this again or play all that same content again in the new version, but you could also go listen to a podcast. Ours is there. But I would actually, because that was our second episode and is pretty rough, I would recommend folks watch out for Fireballs. They did an episode on it last year, and it was a really, really good one. They did their full deep dive, which is to say that they spent about 2 hours talking through every single ending and what it meant to them. And so I would recommend if you really want that sort of granular talk about the original game, go check that out. We are, I think, about to, by necessity, move into talking about spoilers for the new content.
I'll just say that you can also, if you have never played the new game, or have never played the game, or you played it a long time ago, even though the new content becomes available, you can continue to just ignore it and play through the original game as much as you want before engaging with the with the new content. It does it in a, of course, smart and funny way. So I guess we'll talk about that after the spoiler break.
Yeah. So should we just go ahead and have a spoiler break? Anybody have any last thoughts about the original Stanley Parable before we start talking about the ways in which it's been expanded upon here?
Only to say that when it comes to games kind of this type, this is part of the original wave of what might be called walking simulators or just environmental narrative games. This is, without a doubt, my favorite. And the one I would probably recommend to the most people. It's the original Stanley Parable lent a degree of kind of narrative or writing respectability to that genre that was really recognized at the time. And I don't know that we have had something that hit this this sweet spot of like humor and excellent writing and intriguing themes perfectly, but maybe even more so because it was very much a game about games. There's a reason that like the Academy Award so often goes to a movie about the movies,
Right.
The critics of a given genre or medium are often really drawn to things that kind of cross-examine the tropes and the kind of implicit ideas in that medium. And this is really the case here. The Stanley Parable was on Game of the Year lists up and down the year that it was released. And
not just with critics, like players love this too. And I think it's because it is a piece of great art that deeply connects with people who play games, no matter what type of gamer they are. Like this is, I think, one of those pieces of art that is just, it's nearly universal. It is about so many interesting things, but it's also just like, it is so specific to games as a medium. If you play games, this is going to mean something to you in a way that like I can't think of another game that does this.
Yeah, I'd also just say like I don't know that I've played a game still that is as consistently funny as this game. I think like games often will have humor as
it's so
icing.
Unfair that this game is so smart and so funny. It's
stupid.
So unfair.
It's stupid. I mean, games will use humor as like icing on the cake. I think that's like Portal, not to make a cake pun, but like, the humor is what a lot of people remember from that game. But if it wasn't for the awesome puzzles and awesome, mechanics, like that game would not have hit as hard as it did. This game is funny end to end and is uniquely funny. And I don't think I've played a game as funny since.
It's also, really pioneering in games narration. This came out the original mod came out in 2011. The only other game that I can think of that would have come out around that same time that was playing with this same idea was Bastion. But this game and that both came out around the same time. The original mod and Bastion both came out in 2011. And kicked off a kind of a revolution in narration in video games. Like, I think this was around the time when people realized that this was a thing you could do. And still, no one has ever topped their narration in the Stanley Parable. This is easily the high watermark for narration in video games, both in terms of performance and in terms of how narration is deployed to tell its story, to impart themes, to comment on the genre, to do all of the things that Stanley Parable does so well. This is easily the high watermark for narration in games and maybe in all media for all time.
Yeah, I mean, having a lovely British man narrate your thing is like a tale as old as time. As soon as we could start, I think, recording audio, having a person with a beautiful British accent narrate that, just speaking into a microphone has existed forever. But utilizing it in this way, in this sort of meta comedy video game, like you said, I don't think it's been repeated.
Yeah.
I also think it's worth mentioning that this game respects your time in a way that very few games do. It is a very, very tight loop. It is a one lever joke dispenser. And the minute that you are not enjoying the game, like you just don't start the next loop, and your experience with it is complete. This is a game that rewards poking around and exploring every nook and cranny in a way that very few games do, by dispensing more fun endings and funny jokes and good story. But it's also a game that gives you the entire thing, the entire idea, in about 5 minutes.
Yeah, all of the doors are pretty much always open. So if you are, you know there was a choice that you had, even at like the very end of a long arc, and you're like, well, I went left and I want to go right. You can basically run straight to that thing. Every once in a while, there may be some little narrative things that you have to, hit a button and wait for an elevator, or, wait for something to open up. But for the most part, the world is pretty open, and you can just blow through it, and the narrator will adapt, stop talking, and pick up the next piece. And you can just get from choice situation to choice situation pretty fast. I mean, there's dozens of endings, and I think you can finish this game, even if you're a completionist, at least the original game, in just a couple hours. And then same for the new content. Just I think a little bit longer if you're going to go through and, kind of like what we had done, which is play a little bit at the beginning and then exhaust the new content. It's maybe a little bit longer, but as Shane was saying, you still have complete control over all of that.
Yeah, I went back and looked at my Steam play clock. I don't know how accurate that is, looking back at a game that I last really put time into back in 2014. But on the original game, I think I spent 4 hours with it, and saw, I think, pretty much every single ending. You can probably do the entire game in 2 hours if you are motivated and poking around very, very carefully. This new expanded version, I spent maybe 5 or 6 hours with, and that was spread across like refreshing my memory on some of the original content and all of the new content. But yeah, this new stuff feels essentially like an entire new game, and of a similar depth and weight to the original game. There's a little bit of, I think, a difference in tone, which we'll talk about. But it's still, I think, very much like, if you wanted more of the Stanley Parable, if you wanted more doors to open and more things, more buttons to poke and more levers to pull to dispense more jokes and more ideas, that is what this is. This is the Stanley Parable, but more. 10 years later, almost, which is just wild, and I'm so glad this exists. I do also want to set one other thing up before we start talking about the new content, and that is sort of talking about the provenance of this thing. Because they're very famously, like the original game came together when Davey Wreden, who created the original mod, was looking around for somebody to collaborate with to maybe continue to expand it. And William Pugh, I think I'm getting his last name right, came to Davey Wreden and said, hey, let's collaborate on this and expand it and release it. And they worked together on creating the finished Stanley Parable, finalized game that was released. And then they went their separate ways pretty soon after that. So like they were together under the name Galactic Cafe when they created the original Stanley Parable game. And afterwards, Davey Wreden went on. They sort of split up. Davey Wreden went on to start his own studio, Everything Unlimited Limited, where they made the Beginner's Guide in 2015, which is another game that I think about every day.
Heavily influenced by Stanley Parable as well.
It's not as funny as the Stanley Parable, but in some ways it has more of that sort of really cerebral side of Stanley Parable. And then William Pugh went the opposite direction. He created Crows. Great studio name, all-time great studio name.
Yes.
Where he worked along with Justin Roiland. They did the game Dr. Langeskov, which we've talked about on the show. They did that VR game Accounting, and its sort of expanded version Accounting Plus. And so you can kind of see the sort of left brain, right brain thing between Davey Wreden and William Pugh. where they like Davey Wreden went off making the more philosophical game, and Pew went off and made the more comedy game, and they've come back together here to expand Ultra Deluxe. But this is still under the auspices of Crows, which, from what I can tell, just from a sort of business standpoint, is a thriving studio. But Crows was the Langeskov and accounting and Justin Roiland studio. I think that this expanded content has more of the feel of that side of the Stanley Parable than it does of the side of the Stanley Parable that would beget the Beginner's Guide.
Yes.
This is a very, very funny game, and it makes many excellent jokes that fit perfectly into the Stanley Parable. But I would say the majority of it feels more of a piece with the Dr. Langeskov, jokey, but not as much. It's fun. It's got heart, but it has a little less soul, if that makes sense. Than the original game, which isn't to say that it is bad. It is phenomenal. I'm so glad that this exists, and I had so much fun exploring it. And it does have moments of true depth. But it's a bit of a different thing.
I think it's more of a think piece on gaming over the last 10 years, and the act of making a sequel to something 10 years later than it is about like the nature of choice. In a lot of ways, I think it's like the Matrix Resurrections, their approach. I don't think either of you saw it, but that's a weird movie that's mostly about making a sequel to something that's really popular and important. And I think there is an overlap on this as well. Not exactly the same, but I got some similar vibes to like, what's it like when a bunch of very smart people try to write a sequel about making a sequel? And it's worth playing, and it is still as funny as ever.
This is still like top shelf, really good shit. But it hits different. And I think you're right, Nate. This is more a game about the Stanley Parable than it is a game about the staring into the depths of your own soul and discovering that you have never made a choice.
Which I think is good, because I don't know how much deeper they could have gone with that after considering the original game. Like, I think it was purposeful that they are looking more inward and more about the Stanley Parable as a piece of art than about like some of the themes that the original game was trying to tackle. Because I think that's just how you end up with a boring sequel, and that was not this.
Yeah. It's also like how do you write a sequel to a game in which fundamentally nothing happened?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, like purposefully nothing happens, right? Yes. I mean, I guess depending on which ending you decide on,
or everything
has happened. Yeah.
Yeah, that's sort of the thing that like one of the major sort of theses of the original Stanley Parable was like if you look back at the original trailer for the Stanley Parable, it has this very specific feeling. It has a bunch of stuff in it that isn't in the game, and it's parodying this idea that was very popular in games media at the time. That like, in this game you can do everything. This is the game where you can you can climb
like Grand Theft Auto or whatever.
You can talk to every NPC and all of them will tell you
where see it on screen. You can go there, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to remember specifically because it's been too long since I've seen that trailer. It was years ago, but it's like you've kill a man and turn his ghost into you can turn his ghost into a bicycle. You can ride that bicycle up a hill. Like random stuff. The kind of stuff they were showing in the trailer was this idea that like it's a parody of this concept that games involve, that it's possible to make a game where you can do anything. And would that even be something that you want? No, a game that you can do everything would become nothing, right?
Yeah.
And so it's I don't even know where I was going with that. This game isn't the sequel, the Ultra Deluxe content is it's a very different beast than the original game, which had, I think, it had more to say. But this game still has a lot to say about the act of creation, the act of creating games, and very especially the act of reflecting. What does it mean to reflect on a classic game? What does it mean to revisit a classic game? What does it mean to create a sequel or expand on a complete work of art? This is the kind of stuff that I'm sure was at the forefront of their minds when they were trying to decide, is it something that we could even consider doing, making a new Stanley Parable game?
Dealing with the good and bad reviews of a classic piece of art. It's all in there, much like in Matrix Resurrections. But
I was 1,000% going to talk about Matrix Resurrections. It is so much like the tone is so similar because
I'm the one man out here who hasn't seen it. No, so feel free to. I'll hum and put my fingers in my ears.
So in the Matrix Resurrection, one of the plot points, spoilers for that movie, is that Neo has been kind of brainwashed back into the Matrix, and the events of the original Matrix were like something in a video game that he made, and so there's lots of scenes of people like discussing the creation of like, how do you make a sequel, and it's kind of a meta commentary on like going back to like something complete that people liked, and like what would you add to it, how would you change it, how do you make a sequel, what do the fans want, that sort of thing. So there's very much the same kind of internal debate here about what do fans want and expect, and how do we expand on something? Like, what can we add to the experience of the Stanley Parable?
Well, then I think now is the time when we have to do our spoiler break. So we're going to be discussing some of those expansions, some of those new things that are part of this expanded Stanley Parable content. So if you are concerned about that, we'll see you on the other side of the spoiler break. But if you haven't played the Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe, I recommend doing that right now. You can download it on pretty much everything. It's out on consoles. Let me see which ones. I think all of them.
I think
all the relevant consoles. Yeah. It's also on Steam. I played it on the Steam Deck. It is currently I'm just flexing with that right now. I played the whole thing start to finish on the Steam Deck. It was great. It runs great.
I played it on my Playdate. It was.
Man.
I went back and got the original Mac laptop that I played the original on, just to be authentic, unlike you clods.
Wow.
And it is, I believe, a $25 game. But if you purchased if you're doing the PC version, the Steam version, and you own the original Stanley Parable, you get a discount, 33% off. I think it was like $17 something for me. So if you have that, and pretty much everybody who has a Steam account and two thumbs does at this point, because the game has been so widely, like it's like almost 10 years old, and it's been in bundles and stuff. You probably already own the Stanley Parable if you have a Steam account, and so you can get it there a little cheaper, and it'll run on practically anything. I'm pretty sure they have a Mac version on Steam, and I would expect it'll run on pretty much any spec machine. The original Stanley Parable would run on a potato, and this will probably run on a potato and a half. So it ran great on the Steam Deck. I got like 5 hours plus of battery life, which is saying something for a game that involves 3D graphics of any sort. So anyway, any last thoughts before we do our spoiler break?
Only that I'm pretty sure that every episode for the next like couple of years will involve you telling us how the game runs on the Steam Deck.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I guarantee that's the case. And ladies and gentlemen, here it is, your spoiler break. So booting up the Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe, you might have a hard time telling it apart from the original game. It looks a little better, but not a ton better. And
it doesn't need to look any better too. It's not like there was, anything really to look at outside of,
it's intentionally bland.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. So that's not a problem. But you might have a hard time at first the game really does, I think, want you to sort of like, hey, spend 10 minutes remembering how you felt about the Stanley Parable.
Yeah.
So what did you guys do when you first dropped into the Stanley Parable? What was your first run, or what did you do?
I went straight for the do everything the narrator says ending, which takes you to takes you beneath the office to a mind control facility where you can then shut it down and then walk out into the sunlight.
I immediately did the same thing, almost. I did everything the narrator said, because that's what the first thing I did when I first played the Stanley Parable. But then the last moment when you get to the mind control facility door, mind control facility, what an intriguing name.
Yeah.
When you've gotta go in. But there's a side chute that says escape.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, of course I've got to take. This seems like it's going to be the last major choice in the game, so I always do. The very first time I played the game, this is what I did, and I did it again this time. Go down the escape corridor, and as you're walking down that very long hallway away from the mind control facility, the narrator is berating you, saying, "Stanley walked down the facility. Even though this was labeled escape, it was truly heading to his certain death. There was no door closed behind him. He could turn around and go back at any time. But instead, Stanley continued down this corridor to his almost certain death." And then you drop into a crushing machine, and as you're being advanced slowly towards the crushing machine, just as the jaws of the crushing machine are about to crush the life out of you, the narrator is replaced by a different narrator, a female narrator, who, now we are still talking, by the way, of course, about the original game, but I can't help but just talk about the museum ending, because I want to talk about its strange reverse version, which is amazing. But the museum ending, this escape ending, you don't actually get crushed to death, at least at first. You drop into a museum full of assets from the development of the Stanley Parable, where you can, for example, see elements of the original mod, and there's it's like a museum exhibit about the game that you've just been playing. And then finally, as you exit the museum, you drop back into the crushing machine, and as you're advancing towards the crushing machine, the female narrator, which I love that, because it implies there is a power above the malevolent British narrator, right? Is imploring you, saying like look at these two, how they wish to control one another, how they wish to destroy one another, how they both wish to be free. And then, it's imploring you, the only way to stop this is not to let Stanley be crushed by the machine and reset the game, but instead to exit the game, to quit it. The only, just like what Shane was talking about a moment ago, the only winning move is not to play, but then of course you get crushed. Because you're playing a video game.
Yeah.
You're playing a video game. You're always going to do the thing, which is such a maddening thing that this game constantly comments on. Is like, you, video game player, are actually quite predictable, because you're a video game player, and you're going to do the video game player thing. You machine, you cog, you piece of shit, and then it crushes you to death for it, and of course it does. I have always loved that ending, maybe more than any other ending in the Stanley Parable, and so of course is what I did first. My God, I love that, the escape or whatever ending. It's so freaking brilliant.
Well, I did I agree. That's one of the best. In the bucket one, which we'll talk about later, is similarly hilarious. But
so hilarious.
As you said, like any good video game player, I went and jumped off the moving what am I trying to say? The lift in the warehouse,
yes.
Where you can jump to your death. That's what I did first, before then going into the basement and getting lost in the mayhem. And one of my favorite endings, which is that basically Stanley goes in circles in the basement, loses his mind more than it already is, and it ends with a sort of a top-down shot of a guy dead on a sidewalk and a woman walking up, and the
Mariella ending.
Yeah, and it's basically
the story of a woman named Mariella.
Yeah, it's and how she found a man dead on the sidewalk, and basically implies that like all of this was real and that it was all happening in Stanley's mind, and he lost his mind, ran out into the street, and died on the sidewalk, and that's the end of it, which is funny.
So I played through 2 of the original version of the game once, and so it's a little hard to tell in the game what it exactly was that I did that triggered the availability of the new content. But I think it was playing through what I think, maybe you guys can tell me if this happened for you, was the only one of the original game endings that's altered in the original game. And that's the other video games ending. So in that version, in that playthrough, in that sort of route, you do what Nate was just describing. You jump off of the lift, and you find yourself in that room with the red door and the blue door. This is where like the narrator, it begins telling you like, Icy, you're trying to get off the rails, but we were off on the wrong foot. You don't understand. I'm trying to show you something beautiful. Work with me here. Let me tell you a beautiful story. And then he puts you in, he says, Stanley walked through the red door.
Yeah.
And he gives you the room with a red door and a blue door. And of course you do the blue door again and again. And the narrator continues to make that more and more insistent. He puts you back in the room again. He puts the blue door behind you, so you have to turn around. He puts arrows all over the red door, trying to tell you like, this door, Stanley, this door. He walks through the red door. And if you don't, he throws a bit of a fit and says that he's going. He puts a third door. I think it's like an orange door, and if you go through that, then the narrator has a new game for you to play. He's oh, you're so tired of the game I've been trying to create for you, Stanley. Well, here, let's create something new. It's a brand new game, and you end up in a room with like orange developer textures. You go through one new orange door. It's like the new orange door. Would you say that enhanced your experience, and you end up in a room with a please rate your experience thing where you can choose whether adding one additional door to the game enhanced your experience 1 through 5, and you can rate it. Of course, I did a 2, which is the most mediocre of all numbers 1 through 5. And then the narrator gives you a new game to play, which is the game where a baby is crawling towards fire. And you have to press a button to reset the baby and keep it.
Yes, if I recall correctly, there's a special ending if you press to keep the baby out of the fire for like an entire day.
It's 4 hours. He says this is really going to set this game is brilliant. It's really about the conflict of parental life, and but the true feeling of the game.
Little did I know when I played it originally, that's absolutely true.
Oh, we played this game last when none of us had kids, I think. Or
it was 8 years ago. Not
my God,
our kids are basically the same age, Reagan. So,
oh man,
yeah. Well, I did not. So Reagan, your theory is wrong because I didn't do that one.
The one area, so I know I was sort of talking a lot about this ending, but there's a significant part of it that was the only element that is different in the Ultra Deluxe version. So I thought I'd touch on it here. And this was also what led for me into the the new content. You finish with the baby, which of course, like a monster, I let the baby burn. And yes, Shane, you're right. If you he says that the truth of this, the beauty of this really only becomes apparent if you've been playing it for 4 hours. Well, you play it for 2 hours. If you manage to continue playing it for 2 hours, in order to defeat people who've got mouse script things on, he adds another button at 2 hours, and you have to run between the 2 different buttons to keep a puppy from being dunked into acid. And then if you manage after 4 complete hours, there's an ending there that I've never seen except on YouTube, because what kind of idiot am I? But no, in this, if you let the baby burn, he says, well, fine, let's play a different game. And let's play someone else's game. And in the original game, he would drop you first into Minecraft, and it was a very funny bit where he shows you around a Minecraft level and builds a little 1-1 house, right? And has a freak out about the open world nature of the game, and then drops you into the first level of Portal. and you play through the first level of Portal with the malevolent, the Stanley Parable narrator instead of GLaDOS. Incredible stuff from the original game. But here in this version of the game, those two cameo appearances of other games have been replaced by Firewatch and Rocket League, of all things.
Oh, funny.
So you're dropped into the tower from Firewatch, and it's a really accurate recreation of the Firewatch tower. Except there are some very small differences. Like if you squint really closely at the typewriter in there, it's got a sort of Stephen King like written again and again sentence, but it says "Who watches the Firewatch? It's who Firewatches the Firewatch?"
Nice.
You escape from the fire tower, which the narrator very, very amusingly says, "Oh, this must be a game about being some kind of creeper up here in a creep tower." And escape from there. He builds a wall around you because the narrator's too freaked out by the open world nature of Firewatch. And then you go on to score some sweet goals in a Rocket League game where you're running around on foot as Stanley on a Rocket League pitch. To be honest, I think that the original game's cameo versions were better and fit more thematically. But it was neat to see those updated and with some new content there. And as soon as I finished with that ending, that was where the new content kicked in for me. The very next restart, suddenly there was the new content door.
This is so funny. I was a little, I was unsure how they would introduce the new content, but I was pleasantly surprised that it was just a giant door labeled new content.
Yeah, I think it has something to do with the amount of endings because mine had, none of that. And I did the one where you go up and he's like, okay, well, the real story is that there's someone you've been needing to reconnect with. And this is once you've gone completely off of the beaten path and you go to a dark room with a phone ringing and it's like, answer, reconnect with the person that you've loved. And you can just go and unplug the phone, which is such a funny ending. And, it spirals from there. And after that one is when, you're walking through the hallway you've always walked through. And there's now a door that just says new content and it's ajar. Most of the doors had been closed in that area. So it's pretty obvious to go in there. And, that's where the game spirals out from, which is so funny to just have a new door that says new content, like super obvious, very, very Stanley Parable.
And the wonderful thing about it is it feels like, or the way it's presented is that the narrator is discovering the new content along with you.
Yeah.
He's sort of, at first at least, he's sort of feeling like disappointed by the new content because the initial new content, I guess, route or ending, and this begins sort of like a sequence of endings that are kind of one after another, is like first presents like, wow, now there's what was the first one? Is it the jump circle?
Because that's all that it really is, right? Is the new content. You go in and first it's a long elevator and he's like, wow, this is boring, just an elevator. And then I think there's another elevator and he's ranting about elevators. And then you enter into a room that is just the jump circle. And once you enter into it, you can jump, which is nice. Any game where you can't.
But only in
the circle. And there's
only 36
Yeah,
times.
there's a counter on the wall that says jumps remaining. And
Did
I don't know
you
about
use up your jumps?
Absolutely,
Of course
I used
I did,
them
immediately.
Yeah, which really bit
and what
me.
happens after you use up your jumps? I wasn't going to sit there and jump.
You just can't jump anymore.
You can't jump anymore, and it really bites you in the ass when you get to the second jump circle and you have no jumps remaining. I was really disappointed not to get to do the later jump circle.
And then you walk past the jump circle, which is just labeled new content, the jump circle. And then there's just like a little whiteboard on which it says, thank you for enjoying the new content. And then there you go, you're done. And you get just zonked back out to the title screen again. You're back to your office again. And the implication is like, that's it, right? That's all the new content that you're going to get. But the narrator isn't satisfied with that. And, narration, there's a bunch of narration content and he adds some new content. And the narrator introduces you to, I think he tells you to climb through a vent or something. He's like, hey, Stanley, this way. and you go through a vent and you end up at the memory zone, which is where the real new content begins. The memory zone is where the narrator has assembled his memories of the original Stanley Parable game from 2013. And so mostly what you're doing is sort of touring his very beautiful museum of Stanley Parable reviews.
God, I love that part.
Which is hysterical. There's a wonderful bit where he just like is reading from some of the positive reviews, like there. In fact, there's he reads from, I think it was the PC Gamer, or I forget what outlet, review written by James Stephanie Sterling, which, by the way, I thought it was a very nice touch from the developers that they were using James Stephanie Sterling. The review was written like 10 years ago, and they used James Stephanie Sterling's full new name, which is nice, rather than the name that the review would have been credited as 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Say like a review saying like, it's not, this game is all games. And oh my gosh, the like self-satisfied, chuffed voice on that narrator when he's reading the positive review from 10 years ago. And then down in the basement of the memory zone, that's where he keeps all of the Steam
the negative
reviews.
Steam reviews.
Well, no, it's pressurized gas. Is that they don't even say Steam, which is funny because they do name the other. It's like Destructoid and PC Gamer and whatnot. And this one it's that they don't say Steam. They just say pressurized. Or is it like pressurized water or something like that? But
I forget what they said, but that is probably a smart choice to not have to like change that narration when they release on consoles. You know what I mean? Like, I bet you that.
Well, I played on PS5, but I mean, it was pulling all the reviews from Steam. It's literally like screenshots.
Although, you know what? I wonder if that narration is different, because I don't remember them saying something about like.
I don't think it was that way on the Steam version.
Yeah, I think in the Steam version they just say Steam reviews.
Oh, really? Okay, so
I think that might be different.
Yeah,
it's probably one of those things like I bet you that the PlayStation review committee or whatever doesn't like it when you reference Steam.
Maybe, yeah, because it was called pressure. I'm pretty sure it's pressurized gas was the. It's all over the walls. Pressurized gas. And it's like, and he says like, these reviews from this like archaic web store or whatever, pressurized gas, and like I figured
that's very funny.
Yeah,
no, it definitely was.
I didn't even think of it as a potential like copyright or just like conflict of interest thing. It was, to me, it's just like, oh yeah, they're going to show all these bad reviews. They're going to kind of make fun of people who leave reviews on Steam. So I figured they were just making it a joke. But I mean, maybe both. Maybe it's both. But that's pretty funny that it's not in Steam.
That is actually, I mean, of course they turn every challenge into an opportunity here, like for a good joke. But this leads into what I still think is the high watermark for the sort of philosophical side of the Stanley Parable's new content, and that is the skip button.
Yeah,
the skip button is amazing. So one of the Steam reviews was like, I forget what all there was multiple Steam reviews, and he has like little solutions to give the people what they want for various ones, I think. But the key one was a Steam review that complains about the wordy narrator, which how could you monster?
Yeah.
But a Steam, and I think maybe they're fake reviews anyway, but I'm sure.
I bet they're real reviews. I like for every 99.9% beloved game, there's the 0.01% who are going to hate it, right? So
yeah, you're probably right. And I don't know, but like one of the reviews says like, if only there was a skip button for the narrator, which I could see being a thing someone would say. It's monstrous given the well, first of all,
it's the whole game,
how good the game is,
yeah.
But also given what the skip button does to the poor narrator in this game. You get to the narrator says, well, you have to give the people what they want. So he creates a skip button. He ushers you into a small, very bland looking room featuring a small plant, a potted plant, and a button on a pedestal with a little fast forward symbol on it. And he explains to you that this is the skip button. And this is his way of acting on the criticisms of the Steam reviews, and you can press it at any time. He starts monologuing to you about the reviews, and it's quite a lot of narration, and you can sit through quite a lot of narrator talk there if you'd like.
Yeah,
but it's almost sort of parodying itself to the point where it's like, well, now you really do want to use the skip
really
button,
egging
right?
you on to use the skip button, and when you do, it jumps forward and he says, "Yes, look, how was it? Did you enjoy using the skip button?" And
it was a bit odd just watching you stand there frozen in time while I was sitting here, perfectly aware and able to continue talking. And I kept talking to you for a while, and it was fine. But yes, you can press the skip button if you like, Stanley, and then you press it again, and it seems that this time the skip button froze you in time for a bit of a longer time, and then you do it again.
He's becoming increasingly unhappy with how long he's alone, just sitting and looking at you, just being frozen in time. It's so funny and also deeply dark. There's at one point you come back and he's just talking and he's just monologuing. Have either of you ever seen the Reggie Watts, his TED Talk, where he talks for almost 20 minutes, and he does like songs in between it, but he talks for almost 20 minutes and he never actually says anything coherent, but he strings together very smart sounding sentences and very smart sounding concepts. I was certain that they had just copied Reggie Watts' monologue from this TED Talk into this. I tried to look it up, but there was no, there wasn't just like an obvious Google hit on that, but it's basically the same thing. If you haven't watched this TED Talk, I highly recommend it.
That sounds brilliant, and no, I've never seen that. Reggie Watts is great.
It's like a mockery of TED Talks, and he's just like, he sounds so smart and so eloquent, but he's not actually saying anything. Anyway, little sidebar, but it reminded me of that. It cracked up. But I mean, every time you skip, he's like, it's been an hour.
You get the sense that it's like it's been 2 weeks, it's been months.
The longest. After he says that you've been gone a year, in the skip, he stops commenting on how long it's been. But that is the point at which he clearly begins to go mad from the isolation.
Yeah,
and there is no other way out of this room. So this is, like I said, this reminds me of the Zending, because you are. Mm-hmm. You're back in a room where the only thing you can do is essentially enact cruelty on the narrator.
Yeah.
And this time starts to fly by as each press of the button sends you further and further into the future.
The plant dies. The room loses power.
Yeah.
Eventually, the walls cave in and light is streaming in through holes in the ceiling.
There's plants that grow from the light. The corner of the room that has collapsed like erupts in like ferns and jungle plants, and then you skip again and all that life is gone.
It's gone. Yeah, this is where I thought like the game on newer systems actually like benefited from it too, because it does look kind of nice. It's not groundbreaking graphics or anything, but for the Stanley Parable, what you're used to in these very dark or very bleak settings, like seeing this like wildlife growing, and then there's nothing you can do but wait for the skip button to come back on, which is just a little bit of time, but enough time for you to sort of soak it all in. Every once in a while you'll come in and there's one where he's just repeating what is like kind of one of the catchphrases of the game, which is the end is never the end, is never the end, is never the end, and he's just saying that over and over and over until you hit skip. And eventually you can climb out of the
things have crumbled enough.
It's all things have crumbled, and it's all just like sand. It's like sand, just for as far as you can see, and you just
a barren wasteland.
Yeah, just walk. You can walk in a direction until eventually, like, whoop, it starts. The whole game starts right over where it always has.
So this is, I think, like I said, I don't think anything in this game like reaches the like philosophical heights of the original game and some of its like big ideas, but like this is one of the high points for me in the game, and it's because it's just reinforcing something that the game has been saying for the entire length of the game, which is that like Stanley and the narrator not need each other to the degree that they define one another. Neither of them can possibly exist without the other. How they wish to control one another, destroy one another, and add to that perhaps become one another, or like the madness of the narrator's existence without Stanley. Stanley's there. He comments on this early on before he goes fully mad, that that it's not just, if you listen to one of his lengthy monologues, he monologues about like he has to talk to Stanley, and he tries talking to Stanley, but Stanley has to hear it. If Stanley doesn't hear it, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And it's chilling and also funny, but also sad. It's so great. And once the game finally resets, it's such a relief that the narrator's back to normal.
Yeah, it's one of the longest ones too, right? This is probably like overall time play. This is one of the longest endings.
Second longest, because I think the one after this is easily the biggest of almost anything, and that's the quote-unquote sequel ending, where you get into the big sequel museum or whatever you want.
That to me felt like the actual opening into the like these little the jump circle and then the skip button. These were like, you know, segues into where the narrator eventually decides, you know what, I can make the sequel that should have always been made. And that is this, you know, what I have a groundbreaking idea. We're going to call it Stanley Parable 2. That's so much better than, you know,
this idea of doing an expanded thing. This is boring. We got to have the sequel. Sequel, Stanley.
I want to get the posters that they like. So basically the narrator brings you into what I think is, you know, sort of aping on convention centers and like, you know, gaming conventions and just all of the sort of fandom conventions that exist that, you know, people go to. And you're brought into a convention center after a bunch of setup about why the Stanley Parable 2 is going to be the best game of all time. And there are all these posters all over that are like, you know, highlighting the number 2, and they're very, very funny. I want to get one of them. And you go into an exhibit room of all the things that the narrator is now going to incorporate into Stanley Parable 2. And this is where it goes back, I think, to making fun of or at least like aping on game development and what people want in games and why games are fun and what, you know, collectibles and hearing your own name in the game and all these different things that, you know, we're used to now that felt very like the original Stanley Parable, but without it, there's almost none of like the existential element to it. It's just really just making fun of video games through this entire convention. And it's fun and stupid and funny. I think my favorite one is the button that will say your name. It's a
button that says the player's name.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we're past spoiler break, but this joke just got me so hard. It has like, there's a huge lead up about press this button and it'll say your name. It'll say your name. It's so awesome.
This will say the name of the player that is playing the game. And you walk up to this button and it says name on it.
Yeah.
And it's got all this fanfare. And then you press it.
It just goes, Jim.
And of course the narrator explains, well, it's still in development.
It will say your name.
We'll say the name of the player playing the game, of course, but right now it can only say Jim, but we're working on it.
Every like addition that he has in that giant exhibit hall demonstrating new features for the Stanley Parable 2 is essentially the same gag, which is we've got an idea for something, but we can't properly implement it.
Not only can we not properly implement it, but we don't know how these various ideas will gel together into a new game. Right, a significant chunk of it later. The other ones on the list, the
Infinite
Reassurance.
Hole.
Oh my god,
that's the other one.
Bucket.
The Infinite Hole, I thought, was also close to the sort of existential stuff, but in its weirdness, where you jump into a hole and you eventually get caught in a hole and you can press like X to change your reality and Y to change the music, and it just gets in this very, very, I think, purposefully trippy thing where you are like swapping Stanley out with like different versions of himself and different angles. It like he becomes like a big fish guy and like
I didn't even
You didn't
delve
do
that deeply into that. I jumped in the hole a couple of times.
Oh, you just got to keep going in that hole, and it turns into a, like the narrator's like, why are you so obsessed with going into the hole? If you just keep jumping into the hole, it gets into I think one of the weirder,
and eventually the hole keeps getting shallower and shallower, so until finally it's like a half-inch deep pit. It's like the endless hole that's like barely a kiddie pool.
Because there are endings within the convention center, and one of the endings within the convention center is being stuck forever in the infinite hole. So
I love it.
Yeah.
The other ones I think are most consequential. All of them are pretty great. The reassurance bucket becomes incredibly important. All of these are trying, he thinks, to address something that players wanted but didn't get out of the original game. So like the button that says the name of the player that is playing the game is there to provide that vital recognition of the humanity of the player that all players want when they play a video game.
And it's also, I think, fundamentally a recognition of the fact that Stanley is a vessel for the real person playing the game, and like they essentially just needed a name for the character of Stanley. There is no character to Stanley; it is just a name.
Yeah, Stanley is a vessel of exactly. But the reassurance bucket is there, according to the narrator, to address the concern of players who became confused or became upset or distressed by the confusing structure of the original game. And so he's provided you with
there are some very
bucket.
Yeah, there are some very disturbing endings to the Stanley Parable. So
right. And if you were the sort of person who was distressed in any way by those things, you can hold the reassurance bucket, and it will help you feel calm and at peace as you play the Stanley Parable 2.
Did anyone else think this was a straight lift of the portal gag, the companion cube?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's definitely got a nod there, but in this case, it changes all of the vibe. It's more about, it's not just about like carrying a thing around to spite the narrator. This is sort of the reverse. Like you're carrying this thing around to provide yourself with calm. So says the narrator. There's also new decorations for the office. It gives you a choice between balloons that say "Get well someday" or "Happy 12th birthday, step niece." And whichever option you choose, the narrator decides to go with the other one and then decorates the entire office complex with those balloons.
Yeah, it's very funny. Which one did you choose?
Oh, I chose "Happy 12th birthday, step niece," which is extremely funny. And then, of course, the narrator then used all of the white "Get well someday" balloons.
I had the same choice, Reagan.
The reverse. I loved that line. I think he said something like, I really just needed to say it out loud to know which one was the one that I really wanted.
But sometimes you need someone else to make a choice for you to know which one you really want. Or it's very funny.
Also, to address the complaint that you remember in the previous game, there were a bunch of jokes in the achievements, and this game has an almost identical set of achievements if you look at the list. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that was like achievements suck and are dumb, and the Stanley Parable is aware of that, and so they did some things with the achievements in the previous game that were just great. For example, there was an achievement that you couldn't get in the previous game that was called something like "Test Achievement Please Ignore."
Yes.
And it's brilliant because there's all these people who are like very rabid about getting every achievement, and this was just like a direct stick in their eye, and it's so brilliant.
This is a game. I mean, the Stanley Parable is structurally designed to kind of reward you with more story and endings by poking around and trying everything, and that really jives with the achievement hunter mindset of like, I'm going to see everything this game has to show me. But the fact that they like didn't make any of the endings like achievements per se, the achievements are all things like click on door 430 5 times.
Yep. And I loved their approach to that here because the narrator says like, oh, people kept complaining about that broken achievement in the previous game. Well, in this game, you'll be able to get that achievement with the simple pull of a lever. Here's the machine that will give you the achievement. It's the free achievement machine. Stanley, please pull the lever. And you pull it and nothing happens.
And it doesn't work.
It doesn't work yet. We're working on it.
We're working on it. And then finally, the most important, I think, one of my favorite of the new features in the Stanley Parable that the narrator is introducing is collectibles. No video game would be complete without collectibles. Finally,
Gotta have 'em.
You get collectibles. There will be 6 Stanley figurines hidden throughout the game that you can find, and the narrator informs you that there simply will be no benefit to collecting these collectibles. It is there simply for the joy of collecting, because of course collectibles are an inherent good and everyone loves them.
Of course.
And they love the feeling they get when they collect them. And so if you collect all of these collectibles, there will be no prize. You will not unlock anything. You will simply get these 6 collectibles. Now, in typical fashion, that is a lie, but it is a wonderful, wonderful lie. And what else is there?
It would be so much fun, I think, for us to just continue to talk beat by beat through each of these endings, because they're so funny and they're so fun and each one is unique. But we're pretty far into our runtime at this point, so I think we probably can move past some of this and get to kind of the bigger ending of the whole game. And our final thoughts.
Yeah, you're right, Nate. I just looked at the clock and I cannot believe how long we've already been recording, and I feel like we've barely scratched the surface. So apologies to my co-hosts and listeners.
No, I mean, I just got done playing this game, and now we've talked through like each ending as well, and I'm basically playing it for a second time, so it's great.
Yeah, the Stanley Parable, the original game, was easily a game that I talked about more time than I played it, and the same thing is
we're marching towards that right now with this game or with this episode.
So skipping over all of the bucket endings, let me just explain what that concept is, or somebody else want to explain what the deal is with the various bucket endings?
I'll give it the briefest of summaries. The narrator basically chills the hell out while you are holding the bucket. That's essentially the gag. The bucket does indeed calm Stanley down. And so you can carry the bucket through, once you pick it up in the first room, to essentially any of the endings of the original game, and you'll get a slight twist or different content. So, for example, if you carry it to the one in which Stanley goes insane and throws himself off of a building and Mariella sees him laying dead on the concrete, you get a slightly chilled out version of that. Maybe not as chill as I expected.
Mariella has a bucket, and she's her life is made better by having seen this man. She realizes how good her life is, and she backflips away. It's so
she says, yes, my life kicks ass, and she backflips all the way to work.
Yeah, or if you jump off the thing and kill yourself. It's because Stanley was content in his life and wanted to spend eternity with his bucket. And ultimately, this was a good thing for him in the bucket to die in each other's arms. Like, it can still be dark, but everything is twisted into, like, this is good. This is fun. It's fine.
And some of them are more different than others, but there is essentially a bucket version of every single ending in the game. And they're all hysterical. My absolute favorite is if you go all the way to the mind control facility and you decide to turn on the mind control facility, rather than the sort of dark, scary mind control facility, it turns on a video of silly birds. And you can use the buttons in the mind control facility to flip through various videos of silly birds. And silly bird ending.
Yep, and they spend the rest of their lives just monitoring silly birds.
And the bucket.
It's the best ending.
It's watching silly birds.
My favorite, there was an ending that I never got in the original, and I wanted to try. And so, of course, I got the bucket version of it. The timing on this is real annoying, but when you go to the boss's office, if you step inside the doors and then immediately step back out, you trap the narrator inside the boss's office, and and then can leave the building through an escape capsule up near the roof. You go up some stairs. And there's no narration for that one. But if you do this with the bucket, you take the bucket and lovingly put it into the escape capsule and send the bucket out of the game. The bucket is gone. Until you get to the epilogue where you find the bucket.
That's awesome. Yeah.
That is incredible. I didn't know that. That's amazing. So every version of every ending here has a bucket version, and they're all incredible. And some of them are they are mostly just funny. Like the wonderful thing about the original Stanley Parable is it was full of these endings, and many of them were just good jokes, but a lot of them also had incredible like ideas behind them too. Just like, you know, great philosophical ideas about the nature of choice in games. These don't, for the most part. They are just funny, but they're extremely funny.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, like, to me, this became the game. I think I spent as much time running around with this bucket trying different endings than I did in all of the other content together. Like, I spent a lot of time doing these stupid bucket endings.
I'll say one thing. I kind of like I don't know why I kind of breezed through a lot of the content in the like new content area, the new content expo area, right? And so I was really so like, for example, I only jumped in the hole once or a couple times actually. I tried to leave without collecting the bucket. And the narrator said, like, literally threw a brick wall on the exit staircase and said, you know, I really hate to break the illusion of choice like this, but I've got a whole bunch of gags for the bucket.
Oh my God, that's brilliant.
That's awesome.
My God. Oh, I love it. They think of everything. It's just astonishing. So all of those bucket endings aside, I think the last thing that's really worth spending a little time on before we wrap up, because gosh, look at the time, is the collectibles ending and the epilogue. So, you know, the collectibles, the narrator
just let the listeners find that shit for themselves. We've done literally so much.
Oh my God, you're right. Okay, listeners, we
come
will
and tell us
talk.
what you think.
It's worth it to find the Stanley figurines. Yeah.
It's so worth it. In fact, I would say that the kind of true ending of the Stanley Parable is the collectibles ending and its associated epilogue. You need to do it, and it really puts a cap on the Stanley Parable franchise. So
I'm going to say these are the new Riddler trophies.
So I guess we leave it at that. Should we leave it here, guys?
Yeah, I think
leave it for another 10 years until the next Stanley Parable game comes out.
Stanley Parable Resurrections. Yeah, I think I think we gotta call it. I mean, I think if you want to keep talking with us,
I could literally talk about the Stanley Parable for another 3 hours.
If you want to talk to us more about the Stanley Parable, join our Discord, because certainly there's plenty more to talk about in there.
Yes, thank you very much, Nate. And you can find.
Don't join the Crows Discord. Those people are weird over there.
Too many crows.
Yeah, and don't get lost in the shuffle over there in their busy workday Discord.
We have all the space.
Quiet little speakeasy Discord. So you can find us. If you want to join the Discord, you can find our Patreon at patreon.com/theshortgame, which is where you will find all of our. You'll find many benefits, such as early release of podcasts. You get our podcasts as soon as I finish editing them. In this case, it'll probably be
moments before
the general release, because it's such a long boy. But normally you get it a few days early. Some people like that. But you also get access to the Discord. You can participate in occasional polls and things like that. And also, if you back at the $5 a month level, I will send you stickers to put on your bucket.
Nice.
They will be beautiful short game stickers. You can put them all over your Stanley Parable bucket. Let's see. You can also find us on the internet at www.theshortgame.net, where you'll find our contact form, another great way to reach us. You can find our show on all of the podcast platforms. If somehow you're listening to this without being subscribed to the show, I keep hearing podcasts saying like, "Hey, have you subscribed to the show? Make sure to subscribe to the show." And I always had this sort of existential moment of like, how are they listening if they haven't subscribed to the show? I don't understand why people keep telling people to subscribe to the show they're already listening to. But I think what they're meaning is that some podcast apps have the option to listen to shows that you haven't subscribed to. Listener, is that something that you're doing? That's perverse. Subscribe to the show.
Reagan, have you become the narrator from the Stanley Parable?
I think it does rub off after a while, doesn't it? So do that, do the subscribe thing. And also, if your podcast app gives you an option to review the show, that's also a vitally important function. Please do that thing. Let's see. You can find us on Twitter @_shortgame. That's I just have to spell it. I usually spell my Twitter handle because my name's spelled funny, but I don't think people have a hard time spelling short game. It's _shortgame. I'm @Reagan K. That's RAYGANK. And Shane, where can people find you?
I am @8BitShane on Twitter.
And Nate, where can people find you?
On Twitter @NateSTL.
And looking at the time, we definitely don't have time for what's making us happy. So I'll just say what's making me happy is the Stanley Parable. And I just got my playdate. Bye.
Jeez. Reagan ended hype on this one. That was some energy. All right.
My energy came back halfway through.
Yeah.
Talking. The Stanley Parable gives me life. God, I love this game.